Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Offbeat Bloom. Last week we talked about the 5 reasons to keep a personal budget, and this week we're going to be talking about how we gather all the information necessary to prepare that personal budget. Now let's start with your income. For most people this will be the most straightforward piece of the exercise, in part because we are way better at paying attention to how much money we get than how much money we spend. And I say this as someone who has had that problem for a lot of his life. First and foremost, something to keep in mind when we talk about income is that I'm assuming that you have taken out taxes. If you work for somebody else, check your pay stub. Make sure that they're taking out the portion of taxes that they're supposed to take out and hold on your behalf. But if you're self-employed or in any other way a contractor or commissioned work, you really need to pay attention to this because you are going to have to hold this money back yourself in order to pay taxes and cover those sorts of expenses. So it's just something to keep in mind. I can't tell you exactly how much to take. It varies widely by group. Now that we've established the after-tax piece, let's talk about how we actually calculate our income. First, let's talk about salary. Salary is pretty straightforward. It's fixed. It doesn't change greatly regardless of how much more or less you work than the number of hours they're assuming that you're going to work. If you're out sick, if you're on vacation, you still get the same size paycheck. So it ends up being pretty simple. For hourly workers and commissioned workers, the main thing I want to recommend is to take a conservative approach to your income. If you happen to work on tips as well, this applies to you. Now, what do I mean by conservative? Well, in this scenario, what I mean is to take a lower assumption on your income. For example, if you're an hourly employee and you're supposed to work 40 hours a week, but you only actually work 32 hours a week because you get cut on slow days, well, the reality is that that's going to slowly cut in to your actual income. And if your average is closer to 32 than 40, that's going to matter when you actually calculate what your time is. The same applies to overtime. If you tend to get overtime, it's okay to include it, but if you don't, you shouldn't. The same goes for commissioned work. Commissioned work can be difficult because there are much greater swings week to week and month to month. Some months might be feast, other months might be famine. And so the best idea is to take an average of 3 to 6 months and call that your income for any given month. This doesn't help perfectly because it does mean you're going to run on a really tight budget some months, but it does probably mean that on those bigger months where you're overflowing, you need to hold a little more back in savings to be able to deal with the tighter months, if possible. So what time periods should you use? You just heard me mentioning 3 months and 6 months and pay periods. Well, it kind of depends on what your goal is, but you almost want a few different views. The first thing I would recommend is taking a payroll-based view. Now, how many times you get a paycheck in a month can vary greatly. But what this allows you to do is make sure that each pay period you're not overrunning or underrunning in terms of your overall income. This is important because, at least in my experience, I remember having my rent and my student loans and like 2 other bills due in the first half of every month, which meant that that first paycheck got wiped out almost entirely. But the second paycheck had enough that I could hold back some from the second paycheck to make sure that the first paycheck the following month had enough to cover. So that's why I recommend having a payroll-based view early on, is that you can make sure that every single paycheck is covered and you know how to pull forward where you need to. My recommendation, and I actually do this, there's a whiteboard on the other side of this camera that I do this on, is to have 3 rolling pay periods. So 6 weeks worth of bills lined out. And that way you know, oh man, this one's going to be a heavy one. I need to hold back this pay period in order to make sure I have enough to cover next pay period. It can be kind of tricky to think about it in terms of months, but this can be really helpful to get a full view of all of the things you have to pay on a monthly cycle. Finally, in terms of the data that you want to pull, you probably want to pull 3 to 6 months just to get a good average so you can make sure you have a really good idea of how much you're spending on a given cost. Things like utilities, for example, tend to vary widely month to month depending on the season, the weather, all those sorts of things. It just snowed like several times where I live and it hasn't done that. So I know this month is going to spike in terms of utilities. So if I only took this month into my budget, I would be way over assuming for most of my utilities. But if I only took, say, a light month where I could have the windows open, then I'm going to be way under assuming. So a good average can help you offset that. Now, let's talk about expenses. The first question is, what's the best place to find out what my expenses are? If you're using a bank account to do most of your spending and or a credit card, those two sources are probably going to be your best bet because they're going to cover the vast majority of the things you spend on every month. But let's be clear, when I say expenses, I don't just mean bills, and we'll talk in a second about the categories, but we're just going to talk about gathering the information. So bank accounts, credit card statements, those are really good places to start, but that's not where it ends. Look through emails. There may be a lot of receipts that come straight to your email. Make sure all of those are either covered in the bank statements or that you're pulling those in. Make sure you don't double count stuff. Also, one trick, and I'll highly recommend this to anybody, is to start a spending journal. Just taking a notebook, something like this, and writing down all of the expenses you keep, especially all the stuff you spend cash on, because that's not going to appear anywhere else. And pulling that all together to say, this is my spending. Now, like I mentioned, I have a whiteboard over there. I actually list out every bill and how much I spend on average in groceries, eating out, all those sorts of things in one long list. And that's my source for my spend. And anytime I add a new bill or I take off a new bill, I change the numbers on that board. It's pretty useful just as a visual representation. Now for categories. There are 3 main categories I want to talk through, and they have some interrelationship. So let's talk about the first 2 because they tend to be the main 2 that people argue over. That's needs and wants. Now for most people, there's a pretty clear idea of, say, most needs. Our utility bills, so our heating, our cooling, our water, cost of where we live, those sorts of things, everyone's pretty agreed upon are needs. The cost of cars, fuel for cars, or transportation on public transport, those things all are needs, especially where they apply to us getting to and from our jobs. There are 2 main things that fall into the discussion of needs or wants that I find particularly interesting, and I'll render my opinion for what it's worth. The first is a cell phone. It's 2020, y'all. There's no reason to think that you don't need a cell phone. Now, do you need the latest and greatest iPhone or Samsung? No, you don't. But you do need a cell phone. There's no getting around it. It's a necessity in this day and age. Going on to the other piece, the internet. Depending on your life, your job, how you entertain or even manage your affairs, you probably need the internet in your home. For me, both of those things fall into needs. It's just about how high end you want to spend. There's a base level that may not be great, but there's a base level that everybody needs, even if it's not the coolest or the greatest or the fanciest or the fastest. So the rest of wants is basically everything you spend on that isn't related to those needs or to savings, which is category 3. I said this about waste in the first video, I'll say about wants here. Not every want is bad, and I'll talk in a later video about why you should indulge some of your wants some of the time. But for now, just let me say, don't feel bad because some of your spending goes to wants. That's not my point. In fact, let's talk about a healthy ratio between the 3. And this, of course, assumes that you have the capacity to spend this way. Generally, depending on income levels, 50 to 70% of your income should cover your needs. Another 10 to 20% should cover your savings, and whatever remains should go towards wants. On the higher end, you might only get 10% of your income or less going towards wants, if that's how your income structure happens to be right now. But a budget can at least help you make sure that you're not wasting money as you go along. Now that was a really quick view, so let's recap. After-tax income is where you need to start. You need to pick a period of time that applies to both your income and your expenses, and then not only do you need to gather your expenses from places like your bank account or your credit card statements, emails, or spending journal, but you need to categorize them based on whether they're a need, a want, or savings. That's it for this video. Next week, we're going to be talking about how to set goals, and I think that's going to be a really interesting one because it doesn't just apply in the world of making a budget, it actually applies to a lot of other things, so I think the skill set's going to be very, very useful. If you want to know exactly when those videos go up, the best place to follow is on Twitter, @OffbeatBloom. We do have a Patreon. There's a $1 tier to show support and a $5 tier to get these videos a week before they go up on our website and 2 weeks before they go up on YouTube. Our website is OffbeatBloom. They get the video a week before YouTube, and I'll post periodic blogs and production updates right there. If you are watching later on YouTube, please like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, all that fun stuff. And with all that said, we'll see you next week. Bye, buds.